So, as the pandemic showed the world just how fragile supply chains and the just in time inventory model is, it seems like the deglobalization theme is now spreading around the world. So, will this be an inflationary force as countries need to rebuild domestic manufacturing and very likely face higher labor costs as well?
That's my expectation, at least around the margins. And so, of course, deglobalization does not mean we just stop globalizing, right? We don't just end all globalization,
Mhm.
but it means we can stop increasing globalization and maybe pull some of it back. So one simple way to measure it is global trade as a percentage of global GDP. And so, that was rising throughout the 1800s. Then, of course, between World War I and World War II, that was on this lengthy contraction period. It never went to zero, but of course, it started going down. After the resolution of World War II, it went up pretty significantly, and then especially accelerated in the 90s and thereafter, because you had the opening of China, and then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, which brought a number of Eastern European and Central Asian countries to the broader markets. And so basically, there was this big untapped pool of labor. And so a lot of companies around the world did geographic arbitrage. They said, okay, well, we could pay these people 50 cents an hour and eventually increase it to a dollar an hour and $1.50 an hour as they get more developed to make things for us. And that even when you ship it across the world, it ends up being cheaper than paying someone, $15 an hour in the US. And so that was a very disinflationary force combined with, modern electronics and software. Um, the problem is that's not permanent, right? That can only persist so long. Eventually, those markets get quite developed. So right now, China has become more developed, and also, of course, there's this brewing Cold War between the United States and China. They're more economic rivals at this point,
Mhm.
and it hollows out the U.S. industrial base so much that you start to get rising populism and political challenges back home and in other countries that did this, because not every developed country outsourced their supply chain the way that the United States did. They still make stuff in Japan. They still make stuff in Germany, for example. Italy has a current account surplus despite its other problems. They actually have a decent manufacturing base in the northern part of the country. And of course, in the United States, we do make some things, but as a whole, we run this structural trade deficit that's starting to become a political problem. And so I do think we've kind of run this course. COVID kind of put the final nail in the coffin there when it became more of a national security issue about your ability to get ventilators, ability to get masks, basically ability to make things you need. Right now, for example, we have a shortage of medical dyes in the United States because they're like almost 100% of them are made in China. And they've had these severe lockdowns, and that basically means that people have trouble getting an MRI or other sort of digital scans because these components we don't even think of are made on the other side of the world and have logistic problems.
Mhm.
And so I do think that we're entering a period where either globalization is going to stop going up, defined as trade as percentage of GDP, especially ex oil, or it could even start going down to some extent. You could pull back some of that. And so that should be more inflationary overall because you're not doing that geographic arbitrage anymore. Basically, there historically money supply and inflation are very correlated, but you can have periods where you have bigger gaps than normal, where we increase money supply and CPI doesn't go up as much as you expect because you have some sort of massive abundance. And for example, in the 1800s, late 1800s in the United States, you had this whole continent of resources and land, and basically you had a very abundant resources, lots of immigration, so you had lots of cheap labor, and it basically made it so that you didn't have as much inflation as you'd expect from the amount of money supply growth during that time. You had a similar period in the 90s and the 2000s where you had kind of this unusually large amount of disinflation compared to the amount of new money creation because you're basically tapping into this huge pool of resources. And I think overall that pool is a lot more shallow now today.
Mhm. So then, much of the East, as you were just mentioning, but China especially, let's say, became very specialized in manufacturing goods for the rest of the world during this age of globalization. So how do you see, let's say, their GDP suffering of these export heavy countries as this deglobalization really starts to unfold? How does China really make a transition to becoming less of a export heavy country?
So China, I think, is going to slow down overall. And we're already seeing that in the data. I think it's going to be more structural. Their way to pivot, and it's very hard. This is a very hard thing to pivot. It's kind of it's the middle income trap,
Mhm.
where you develop up to a higher level, and then you're no longer a source of cheap manufacturing, or at least as cheap as you were, and then, but you're not quite enough to be advanced. Super high tech industries. Now, and China has a better chance than most of navigating that transition because of its size and some of the other factors there. Um, but basically, what they have to do, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to do it, but I think they're going to try, is to shift a little bit more consumer oriented. And so, for example, if you look at the United States, 100 years ago, we were a export powerhouse. We were the rising power. The UK was the one running the structural trade deficits with us, and we were supplying, the rest of the developed world with goods. We were kind of this rising emerging market, and of course, eventually we shifted towards a more consumer oriented market. And I think, of course, we went too far in that. We became too consumer oriented. Um, and I think China, right now they have one of the lowest levels of consumption relative to their GDP. They're very oriented towards that export industrial base, and I think the transition is for them to consume more of their own production, which basically is generally necessitates policies of stronger currency and more consumer oriented types of reforms. And but I think the challenge there is that you know that doesn't work well with kind of government mandates, right?
Mhm.
If you give the consumer more power, it reduces the relative share of government power, and so I think it'll be a challenging one for them to navigate politically.
Mhm.
But that is the right answer for them to do, which is basically just become a more balanced economy.
Mhm.